Bosses are my favorite part of the Souls games, and it's an aspect that I think FromSoft does very well. So today I wanted to talk about the best boss from each Souls game, from Demon Souls all the way to Elden Ring. As always, there are timestamps for each game if you need them, and this is not including DLC because most of the DLC bosses would rank number 1, and I'd rather do a separate video on that. Starting with Demon Souls, the best boss in my opinion is Old King Allant. I think a lot of people would consider Flame Lurker or the Tower Knight to be the best, but King Allant really shined for me and showed the direction FromSoft was headed in terms of boss design for the series. I don't think I'm alone in my love for the humanoid bosses in the Souls games, and Old King Allant is a perfect example of this. He feels much more aggressive than any of the other bosses and was a really awesome duel for the final boss fight. On top of that, he's resistant to magic, which makes me happy because everyone who finessed their way through this game using magic is in for a rude awakening. If I were to guess, Old King Allant and Flame Lurker were probably the two bosses everyone struggled with the most when this game first came out, which resulted in that rewarding feeling that makes these games so addicting. Allant has some really cool moves that clearly inspired great bosses in future FromSoft titles, but one that didn't carry over is his Soul Drain move. While this move is super predictable, I think it's really funny that FromSoft put in a move like this. Since I'd played all the other Souls games before Demon Souls, the game was pretty much a cakewalk and it didn't bother me too much. But thinking about all the players who had Demon Souls on the PS3 that struggled with this boss for hours only to have him de-level you with one grab is just mean, and also kind of hilarious. The way he uses wind in his attacks is just dope overall, and he's easily my choice for the best boss in Demon Souls. Moving on to Dark Souls, while most people would probably say Ornstein and Smough, I'm actually gonna go with Gwyn. In all fairness, I must admit I'm not a huge fan of the bosses in Dark Souls 1 overall, even though I appreciate how well they tie into the lore, but Gwyn was by far the most enjoyable for me. Every other Souls YouTuber praises Ornstein and Smough for being the perfect gank boss due to the balance of fast and slow attacks from each, and not to mention the pillars. Oh, the pillars just make the whole fight brilliant. I went back and fought them again before I made this list, and I can say while it is objectively a great boss fight, I didn't find it as enjoyable as some of the others. And obviously we're not mentioning DLC here since pretty much any of those bosses would win, but Gwyn is a perfect final boss and checks all the boxes. The way the story builds up to him throughout the game, his aggressive moveset, the soundtrack, everything here is undeniably great. Obviously, he has one major flaw, that being the fact that you can parry him into oblivion with a blindfold on, but even that aspect is enjoyable. He's another boss that showed us where the series was headed in terms of combat, with his style being much more fast-paced than the rest of the bosses. I think that's the reason I like him so much and gave him the spot as the best boss in Dark Souls 1. Now we have Dark Souls 2, another game where the DLC bosses really shined, but the main game has some great bosses as well. My personal pick for this game would be Velstadt. Can you see a pattern in my choices yet? This is the type of boss I look forward to most in these games. Nothing fancy, just a humanoid enemy wearing some dope armor and a solid challenge. But that's the problem. He's not really a challenge. This is the only factor that made me debate his spot as my favorite boss in the main game, just because I feel like if he was a little bit more difficult, it would have been awesome. I considered putting Old Dragon Slayer or Dark Lurker as the #1 spot, but the former is a reskin and the latter has clones reminiscent of game journalists asking for an easy mode. I think Velstadt's lore is pretty cool as well, and even though his moveset is pretty similar to a lot of the larger humanoid enemies in the game, it never gets old for me. I also like that he has magic. It's not super crazy or anything, but it's enough to add some variety to the fight. People seem to have very mixed opinions on him being good, bad, too easy, too hard, but I hope most of you can see why I like him. I think he's a perfect example of what Dark Souls 2 did right and the style of combat they were going for in this game that people seem to either love or hate. Moving on to Bloodborne, maybe I'm stupid for not paying attention to the lore at all, but seeing Gehrman as the final boss in my first playthrough blew my mind. But to be fair, I probably should have assumed he wasn't a great guy. But the quality of this fight is just absolutely incredible. I had mixed opinions on the Bloodborne bosses my first time through because I didn't love the huge beast enemies and I hadn't played the DLC yet, but Gehrman was by far my favorite, and I still think he's the best boss in the main game for a few reasons. First, the challenge. No matter how good I think I am at this game, Gehrman still gives me a run for my money every time I fight him. Obviously, he's a bit easier for me now since I know his attacks and parry windows, but his aggression still catches me off guard and humbles me like all good Souls bosses do. He's one of my favorite final bosses in the series just due to the spectacle and how epic the duel feels. I love how beautiful the arena is, and the fact that it takes place in the hunter's dream through a gate that's been closed the entire game is awesome. Not to mention he has 3 phases with new moves and attacks for each one that keep you on your toes the entire fight. And we all know how much Miyazaki loves toes. Overall, this is just the perfect Bloodborne fight in my opinion, and I genuinely have no complaints. Now we've reached Dark Souls 3, the game where FromSoft essentially perfected the boss fight formula. There are so many incredible bosses in this game, but I think I gotta give this one to the Twin Princes. With one of the most unnecessarily long boss runs in the game, the Twin Princes will keep you running back over and over. This fight to me is just so exhilarating, and I know a lot of people don't like their magic or teleportation, but I think it was executed perfectly. First of all, the lock-on stays active when they teleport for the most part, so it's not super hard to follow. It also makes it so the fight is much more intense and fast-paced, which I always appreciate. This fight balances the aspects of challenge and fun perfectly for me, and it always feels very fair. Each attack is easy to dodge if you time it right, and I love how Lothric will revive Lorien if you don't kill him first. Don't get me wrong, it pissed me off so much the first time I saw him do that. While I also debated between bosses such as Champion Gundyr, Abyss Watchers, the Nameless King, none of these fights were as fun and significant to the game for me as the Twin Princes. I'm curious to see what people say about this pick because I hear differing opinions on the Twin Princes, but I just think it's a really satisfying fight that's perfect for Dark Souls 3. Moving on to Sekiro, I don't think this one will surprise anyone. It's Ishin the Sword Saint, arguably one of the best bosses in the entire series. I was tempted to give this one to Owl Father, but I couldn't possibly put anyone above Ishin. It's also impressive that 4 of my choices in this video were the final bosses of the games. FromSoft really does a great job of sending you off with an incredible battle, and they did not slack here. Ishin was one of the toughest challenges I faced in any video game and took me absolutely forever to get his moves down. But his 3 phases, the atmosphere, the significance of the arena, everything about this fight is done perfectly and was one of those bosses I was convinced I would never beat. Go ahead, comment get good, I know you want to. This truly feels like a test of all your skills and everything you've learned up to that point, so you better be ready. His attacks are lightning fast, no pun intended, and in the second phase, he decides he's had enough with these old-fashioned sword fights and figures he'll just shoot you in the face instead. I'll admit, I thought his spear moves were a little bit cheap at first as well, but when I got it down, it wasn't too bad. Obviously, the third phase is incredible with the lightning bolts in the sky and his attacks with them. It's such a cinematic fight and is also one of the most satisfying in the series. Moving on to Elden Ring, here's where everyone gets mad at me. My choice for the best boss in Elden Ring has to be Godric the Grafted. Here's why. First of all, I think he was sold short a bit being an early game boss. If he was the last boss in the game and had more health, I think everyone would have liked him a lot better than the Elden Beast. Oh yeah, spoilers. Actually, you know, if you haven't finished the game by now, you did this to yourself. Godric is not only the coolest and most fleshed out boss in the game in my opinion, his moveset is also awesome. Combined with an absolutely shocking second phase, I don't know why people say bosses like Moog and Millennia are better. But to be fair, I think some of the others are close. This was just the fight I personally enjoyed the most, and the only problem with it is that it's too easy. Also, it's pretty clear that they put a lot of effort into the early game bosses to draw new players into the game, and it really shows with Godric. I was extremely impressed when I saw him for the first time, especially with how crazy his moveset was and how they incorporated jumping as another tool to dodge for the first time. And I mean, he rips off the head of a dragon and puts it on his arm. How much better could it get? Also, fine, since everyone still wants an outro, here you go.